All right, and we are coming up on 10 o'clock, everyone. So welcome to ATARC's Immediate Future, our AI Persons webinar. This is put together by our AI and Data Policy Working Group as the first and most likely a long discussion surrounding policies created to manage AI. ATARC stands for Advanced Technologies Academic Research Center and is a nonprofit that facilitates collaboration between government, industry, and academia in order to accelerate technology modernization initiatives. We provide ongoing opportunities for cross-agency collaboration through on-site interaction, learning, and market research. So welcome to all the attendees. Thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, I do just want to encourage everyone in the audience to submit questions of your own, if you have any, into the Q&A section of the platform. We'll be going through them at the end of the panel, so please send them in. But I'd like to pass everything over to Ken Farber, our moderator for today's event and our AI and Data Policy Working Group chair, to introduce himself and our speakers for the day. So Ken?
Thanks, Nicole. I'd like to start just by thanking our panelists and everybody else who's making time today for the conversation. The AI and Data Policy Working Group kicked off a couple of years ago. We put together a report on AI policy across the federal government. We put together another AI and data guidebook. And then we thought that it might be a good idea to take a look at other emerging issues around AI that maybe haven't begun to be addressed. And AI personhood came up as something that is probably, our feeling is that it's probably sort of just over the horizon for the federal government. And so maybe it's a good idea, a good time to start a conversation about it. And our common practice might be to go ahead and just throw together a report, you know, something maybe talking about the current research and work in the field, things like that. But when we thought about this topic, we felt that it really wasn't even, for the federal government at least, it wasn't well enough formed to even start doing an assessment of what was going on in the field. We thought a conversation to help inform maybe even the language or the terminology, and to make sure that we captured all the perspectives on something that is so complex and you know, and undefined really. There aren't any frameworks for, maybe I shouldn't say that, as far as we're aware, there aren't any frameworks for AI personhood. There's a lot of research, there's a lot of discussion in philosophical, legal, theological fields, but there isn't one of these artifacts you can pick up and use. So we thought maybe we would start with the conversation and help that, maybe get some definitions started, certainly not established, but we could start talking about that now. So we've got 4 panelists today. Each brings a different perspective to the question. We have folks with a legal background. We have folks with tremendous senior experience in government and management. We have a philosopher. We have the academic background. We also have folks who've been involved in regulatory bodies and international standards organizations because they've been heavily involved in all the areas in and around AI. So we tried to do a good job of bringing together those perspectives for this conversation. And so introductions, my name is Ken Farber. I'm an AI solution architect for TechSnap and the industry chair for the working group. And I'll just be moderating today, so you'll be able to listen to the smart folks talk. I'm going to go ahead and ask the panelists to go ahead and introduce themselves. And then we'll get on to, we've got one question they're each going to answer from their perspective. And then we have some other questions that will be a discussion more than each presenting their own view initially. Tony, would you mind go ahead introducing yourself, and then it'll go to Ansgar and Sandy and David.
Certainly. So my name is Tony Bosey. I'm currently a Presidential Management Fellow on appointment to the National Artificial Intelligence Institute. Before this, I was a professor for some time of philosophy or humanities more broadly. And in some of my graduate studies and in some of my research as a faculty, I focused on personhood, broadly speaking. My original interest was mostly in the line between humans and animals, but then I started to explore the line between humans and corporations, and then ultimately the line between humans and technology. I hope to be able to bring you some government perspective, but less than Sandy, some philosophical perspective, but less than David, and probably some legal perspective, but less than Ansgar. I'll try to be the glue. And I'll pass to Ansgar.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me to be on this. I'm looking forward to a great conversation. So my name is Ansgar Kuna. I'm the Global AI Ethics and Regulatory Leader at EY. You may also know as Ernst & Young. Within EY, I really focus on the AI governance questions. What is the discourse around policy regarding AI that is happening across the globe? So I'm part of the global public policy team. And how can we help clients to understand these issues and to put in place the right kinds of governance frameworks and oversight methodologies when they are introducing AI into the use in their organization? Prior to joining EY 3 years ago, I was a senior research fellow at the University of Nottingham, and my whole career before that was about 17 years of doing academic research on the intersection between computational neuroscience and robotics, which gradually migrated into thinking about the use of online data and those kinds of questions, and as such then the implications of this digital ecosystem that is increasingly growing and that people are experiencing, what kind of impact that is having on people. And so the questions around ethics, the questions around the regulation of this new technology in order to ensure that it serves to the benefit of people is at the heart of a lot of that work. So I hand over to Sandy.
Well, thanks, Ansgar. And it is a privilege to be able to speak to everyone on this call today. There's many people who are in the audience who are equally well-versed on what we're going to discuss. Now, in regards to my background, thanks, Tony, I have many years in the federal government delivering systems that automated using statistical methodologies, which eventually, with enough compute power, becomes what we consider to be today's artificial intelligence. So we put those systems in place. We enabled folks inside the federal government by augmenting their decision capabilities using those tools. And perhaps that's why I am here. However, I did complete my career embedded at where Tony is, at the National Artificial Intelligence Institute, after spending the most of it at the General Services Administration. And the last thing I would add to this that perhaps has some relevance would be that while at the General Services Administration, I participated in creating the Artificial Intelligence Primer. And we moved from there, Ansgar and others who are here participating in creating these documents. We created also a playbook based on the GSA M3 framework, and we moved on to creating another guide, suggestions, not what must be done, called the Ethical Application of Artificial Intelligence. And with that, I'll pass it along to David.
All right, hello, and wonderful to be here and share the stage with these fine individuals. And thank you to Ken for organizing this event today. My name is David Gunkel. I'm professor at Northern Illinois University. I have been researching the question of artificial personhood since about 2006 and have written rather extensively on the subject, most notably 3 books from MIT Press, one called The Machine Question, another one called Robot Rights, and then coming out in the early part of next year, something I call Person, Thing, Robot, a Moral and Legal Ontology for the 21st Century. I'm very gratified to understand that you are beginning to think about this question. Other places have done this. I've consulted with the EU Parliament just earlier this year on this same exact question. And then a year prior to this was in Malta to talk with the Maltese government about similar kinds of questions. So this is bubbling to the surface in a number of places, and it obviously is something that governments are recognizing needs to be talked about and addressed.
Thank you very much, David. That's gratifying to hear that you're looking at it and it looks sort of the same to you, is that this is a topic that's coming up and it looks like our timing is good. So we appreciate that. And just for everybody's awareness, we were planning this panel long before our friend at Google decided that Lambda might be a conscious thing. So just so we'll talk to that reference later. I'm not going to get into that right now, but it's an important event in this topic. So what we'd like to do is start by having each of the panelists answer from their own perspective or address, and however they'd like to, from their own perspective, the question of what do we mean by AI personhood? And so we're hoping by doing that, we'll sort of set the stage, give everybody a chance to give their perspective, and then we'll move on to some other questions that are a little bit closer to the world of federal AI policy. So again, Tony, would you mind kicking us off?
Certainly. So as I alluded to earlier, I'm a little less into the pure line between what is a technological person than David might be. I started my research on animals and people and really just trying to figure out what we meant by person. And then with corporate personhood, which although it long pre-exists me, if we expect that it goes back to Southern Pacific Railroad in 1898 or so. But I was alive for some of the major events and studying during some of the major events in the recent past that led me to think about corporate persons and then technological persons. And I think that the change to thinking about corporations and technology was hard for me because I was a big fan of suffering-based accounts of what a person was. I got generally bothered by what I deemed speciesism and a lot of the ways that we do capacity or conceptual-based lines between animals and people. So I was really into the line of, a person suffers. And then I came to the idea of corporate personhood, and I was like, well, corporation suffering seems a little strange to me. Clearly, there's a line between a moral and a legal person. And we all here today respect that is two very separate conversations, and we're going to try our best to address those conversations separately, but both. The question of what is a legal person, of course, is much clearer. It is somewhat rote. Laws are legal constructs. Legal persons are legal constructs with social respect. I know Ansgar and Dave will probably say a lot more about the specifics of should AI be truly a legal person. When it comes to a more moral or social person, the question becomes a little fuzzier. And it's probably hard to suggest that a machine suffers, although maybe. I do try to push back against myopism about what we understand suffering and communication and some of these things to be. Again, mostly because of my research with animals, I assume that things suffer and think and plan in ways that are important and relevant and functional that are different than ours. And I think maybe some of that thinking about planning and continuity that started to come into personhood discussions in the mid-2000s can be relevant to an AI. Even if an AI doesn't have a soul in a way that some people might want, or even if we don't think that an AI can suffer in some form of phenomenological sense, it does seem like an AI might be the sort of thing that can have a certain sense of a self, a thing that it is that other things are not, and a sense of a continuity between this self and a future self, it in a future state where it is a thing that others are not, and has some form of plan, even if it doesn't have the emotional investment in it per se, has some form of plan of continuity between the current self and the future self. And that sort of time snake, that identity that persists through time, and that continuity of the time point A, planning for time point B, and then time point B becoming realized and being able to reflect back on time point A, is a sort of an understanding of a person as a planning, thinking consistency through time that I think AI can probably get to. And then the question, which I think we'll talk about more, and this will be the last thing I say, becomes like, well, why do we care? Great, it's some sort of moral person in the sense that it's time continuous, but so what? Does it gain responsibility because of this fact? Can we morally affront it because of this fact? And that's a very separate and not very separate, but a separate and much more complicated question. And one of the things that I think we're hoping to talk about today. So that's my, perhaps not helpful, but just some ground setting and some general perspective. Thank you.
Great. So maybe I think the plan was that I would be next on the list. So I think Tony's introduction to this general question of personhood is really great. And certainly in my previous career in academia, when I was working on humanoid robotics and using humanoid robots to try to understand whether our models of how the brain works are actually functionally operationalizable and those kinds of questions, we were certainly looking into trying to do things like reinforcement learning, trying to do things like use the same type of a cumulative learning that you see in children as a way of enabling robots to gain more capabilities. However, if we look at the kind of state that this type of technology currently is, be it in embodied robotics or be it in software, non-embodied kinds of AI systems, I would most certainly say that we are very far away from truly autonomous kind of operating systems. The idea of a sudden leap to a super intelligence does not seem realistic to me, at least. And as such, the focus of conversations around AI personhood at this stage is, I believe, mostly of relevance in this question around the legal personhood, similar to what we see in personhood of organizations, etc. Which in my research coming up to this talk, by the way, I have found a reference to Pope Innocent IV in the 13th century already giving personhood to monasteries. So it's not a completely new idea. But yeah, it's really a question about where does liability lie? Where does the power to hold things like intellectual property rights or other kinds of property rights, or the ability to maintain wealth and those kinds of questions comes into play. And so David will know this in much more depth from his work with the European Parliament. But one of the things that has been driving the conversation around AI personhood at the EU has been that question of, does AI introduce a general kind of new challenge for legislative frameworks that we need a new legal framework to be able to deal with this? Or is AI actually similar to other kinds of tools, and it is simply a tool like a car is or something else, and therefore the liability simply lies with the person who is using or who built the system? And obviously, the reason why that is a question when it comes to AI is because of things like learning, machine learning, where the actual properties of the system develop over time. And you cannot simply point to the original developer to say, well, you built it in this particular way, all of its behaviors are as you defined. That those behaviors changed as it acquired new input while it was running. And so then the question becomes, does that mean the person who was using the system and therefore fed it, that is new kinds of data, is the one who should be liable for this? And one proposal was to sort of shortcut that whole problem of identifying who is the liable party or those kinds of things by saying, well, if we can give a legal personhood to the AI, then the liability lies with the AI. Now, the reason why I don't think that that is really particularly useful is because the AI does not hold value. It wouldn't be accumulating money for itself. You're not going to have a bank account for the AI because the AI, as I said, it doesn't have the psychological side of personhood. It doesn't choose which tasks to do. You are the one that are deploying it to something, you being a person or being an organization. And so assigning a personhood to the AI doesn't really address the question about where liability would lie, because you still need to find the next stage of, yes, but when I'm suing the AI, who's eventually going to be paying, because the AI doesn't have a bank account. And then the other side, of course, it's not just about liability, it's also about things like intellectual property rights. If an AI system is being used to create something new, does the AI start own the intellectual property around that? The question, of course, is that sensible? What is the whole point of intellectual property? And the point of intellectual property is to make it a valuable area of work for somebody to be engaged in. You know, I spent a lot of time and money to create something. That is why I need to have intellectual property to be able to recoup the cost that went into this instead of somebody else just copying that. But if the AI is holding that intellectual property, then what does it exactly gain from this? So from my perspective, at least, assigning personhood to an AI doesn't really address the challenges that we are actually facing when it comes to AI. And as such, it would be merely a kind of surface level activity, but to really address the legal issues, you'd need to go to the next step, which you might as well just do immediately and cut out the AI personhood part. Over to the next person.
Thanks. City.
Well, thank you. And this is hard to follow, other than that I am in complete agreement with what had been said before. So to add to that, jumping off from that point about the legal, it is very interesting. And Ansgar, talking about innocence, the fourth, that was very interesting because corporations are granted rights based on moral and religious choices also, which is very interesting to me. Because then we're making this assumption that a corporation can have a religious affiliation and a moral affiliation. So it obviously goes back to the early church and its use of corporate structures in order to protect property, for instance, as in the monastery. That's a good case. So we have to now start to extrapolate this out, I think, in different ways. By the way, I completely agree with you. And there was an exercise that we did while I was in government that had to do with the early days when we moved to digital, away from a lot of print and other forms of communications. And when we did this deep review in the CIO shop, we found that all of the existing laws, regulations, and policies could be extrapolated to our new and emerging digital environment. We did not at that time see a need for anything new, but simply to understand those and to interpret them properly, but not to create new ones. So Tony, to what you said earlier about that experience, where I did want, and Tony, I like what you said about animals, you know, whether or not they're cognizant, how they communicate, and what rights would they have to achieve something in the legal status of personhood. But I want to also talk about how people sometimes think differently, and that we're going to have to factor in these concepts, not just the moral and the religious, but also how our human minds work. So when we speak about what we consider to be feelings, the capabilities to plan, how we see color, even so simply, if you're a fan of Van Gogh, you might find it very interesting to see how and love how he saw the world. But if he hadn't seen the world differently, will we have that art that we treasure so much today? Well, that can factor into currently how, I'll go back to the psychology that was mentioned, that people in defining personhood, this should factor in that people's minds work differently, that they're wired differently. Not all are the same, but they bring value. And so when we start to look at extrapolating that out, we're going to have to consider that with the machine. Now, Ansgar, and I know we're going to hear a lot from David, who really does know the legal aspects, but I thought it was very cogent of you in what you brought up about owning a property. But so when the last thing I'm going to end on is not rights, because personhood is defined by rights, but perhaps personhood needs to be defined by obligation. And that's where I'll end my few minutes, and over to David.
So this is a really crucial question. And I think this is one of these questions where some terminological precision can really help us in sorting things out and parsing the question in a way that we can make sense of it better. So let me just say three things with regards to this precision that we need to bring to our terminology. The first is this, and we've already alluded to it. There's a distinction between two different kinds of personhood. There is moral or natural personhood and legal personhood. Moral natural persons are like you and I, or even animals, and they're usually benchmarked and determined based on natural capacities like consciousness, sentience, the experience of pain, etc. And therefore, human beings are natural persons. Animals can be natural persons, but obviously corporations are not natural persons, right? But there's also legal personhood. And legal personhood is not based on natural capacities. Legal personhood is based on basically social exigencies. It's a kind of social honorarium that we extend to something in order to make it a subject and not just an object of law. And therefore, we are legal subjects. Animals can also be legal subjects, but this also engages us in extending personhood to corporations, to ships, to organizations, and perhaps even AI. So that's the first thing I would mention. The second thing I would mention is that where we get into trouble, I think, right now in resolving a lot of these questions is that our legal categories are very rigid and very limited. We have only two legal categories by which we can sort things: persons and things. And this goes all the way back to the Roman jurist Gaius, which says that the law is concerned with either persons or things. And so we're trying to compartmentalize AI into one of these categories or the other category. And we're learning that AI seems to resist, on the one hand, reification, but also resist, on the other hand, personification. So how do we fit this into our legal systems when it doesn't quite fit the categories or the ontological distinctions that we have at our disposal? Lastly, there's a difference between the can and the should aspect of our question, right? Can is an ability, should is more of a moral question, or at least a legal question. So if you ask me right now, can AI be a moral or natural person? I would say the probability of this is very low, because we'd have to benchmark it in such a way that we'd find it sentient or conscious or something else. But can AI right now be a legal person? Yeah, all we have to do is make a law that declares AI is a legal person. So the question isn't, can it be a person in the legal sphere, but should it be a person? And that is a question for us. So this is not a question about the AI. This is not a question about the technology per se. It's a question about how we decide and want to integrate this technology into our social sphere and what decisions we want to make for our interests and the best organization of our communities and our individual rights and obligations to each other.
Right. Thank you, David. Appreciate that. I hear a number of themes coming up, and I think they're all pretty useful. We're trying to get more careful about the language. We understand that there are some distinctions between natural and non-natural persons. And then there's a further distinction between legal and moral persons, and trying to figure out where this fits. Ansgar raises a particular point that's important for our group's interests, and that is, are legislative frameworks sufficient? And then David's picked up on that maybe not. I don't know if you meant that, Dave, but I'm going to go ahead and say that. But maybe not. You know, maybe if we have these things, and that's why we find ourselves in this situation of calling corporations persons, because they're doing some things that are kind of like persons, and there's enough interest in letting them do those things that we're considering them kind of like persons. So the AI question, though, I think, as you mentioned, it's challenging to actually figure that out, because its behavior is going to be more, we can anticipate that it's going to be more complex, much more human-like, and much more important to control, because this other question about IP and ownership and liability is really a part where I come down with a question of, is there a risk here as we move into and we further develop a knowledge-based economy, and we create these systems that can just generate knowledge almost infinitely, and where's that wealth going to accumulate? We had a couple of questions lined up to dig into, and I'd like to ask one as sort of a lay of the land question. Are we aware of any instances around the world, in any jurisdiction location, where AIs have been granted personhood? And anybody, I'll just throw that out there. That's why I'd like to, if anybody's got any ideas on that or research.
So there's no decision about personhood per se, but there are decisions about legal standing with regards to various claims that move in the direction of personhood. So I'll just give you two examples. One goes to the question of IP, which both you and a number of other people have brought up. Ryan Abbott and the Artificial Inventor Project have been sort of testing the waters of patent law by bringing suit in a number of jurisdictions on behalf of an AI named Dabus. And what they've done is file a patent that seeks to give the AI the IP over the invention of a food container. This failed in the EU and it failed in the US, mainly because because in both the EU and the US, patents are only attributable to persons. And because the AI is not a person, it can't be an inventor. However, in other jurisdictions, like specifically in Australia and South Africa, where the stipulation does not exist, the AI has now been named the inventor of this food container system and is now the holder of the IP on this particular innovation.
Mhm.
A second place we see this is in 12 jurisdictions statewide in the US. We've now seen laws come into play where we are trying to integrate the personal delivery system robots on our city streets and sidewalks. And so, example, in the Commonwealth of Virginia and in Pennsylvania, delivery robots have the rights of pedestrians on the street. Now, this isn't a decision about the AI or the robot itself being a person, but it is a decision about how we integrate the movement of traffic and how we decide liability and accountability in the case of an accident if a driver should happen to take out one of these personal delivery robots. According to the law as it's written right now, you hit a delivery robot, it's tantamount to hitting a human pedestrian.
Mhm. And to Ansgar's question earlier about liability in those situations, and is the AI that owns the patent, I believe it said Australia, New Zealand, is it positioned in some way to benefit from that?
I don't know. I do know that it has Ryan Abbott and his firm are named the representative of the interests of the AI, so that they can bring suit on behalf of the AI. Now, if they recover damages, I don't know where the money goes.
Right, right. Yeah, that's the tricky bit. Okay, thank you for that. Ansgar, I was wondering if is that getting to your question about the liability, and I'm wondering if you've seen or what you might be able to share with us from the discussions that you've been involved with the EU.
Sure. So first of all, it's a great example that David just raised, and the follow-up question that you had, Ken, was exactly the one that came to my mind. If an AI is the patent holder, who's going to do the enforcing? I mean, the AI isn't going to take the initiative to say, well, I actually think I ought to sue this person, because it doesn't have that capacity to think beyond its task of creating these particular things for which it just got that patent. But that also really, it gets back to that question that I have is, okay, it's great that we have now allocated a patent to the AI, but ultimately, it's really the other parties that have been given the ability to enforce it for the AI, who have all of the practical aspects of the patent. They've received all the practical aspects of that, at least assuming that any enforcement money, that any money collected does actually go to them. If that money goes into some kind of black hole and disappears, that's a different matter, I guess. But have we gained anything from assigning a patent to the AI? That's sort of the question that I would bring to that is, okay, it's nice that we did it, and I'm sure lots of people can write great legal papers about it, but beyond that, how have we achieved anything useful by doing that? And that's really, I think, the core question. That is also, I believe, the core reason why, for instance, at the European Parliament, they decided in the end not to pursue the direction of doing an AI personhood, but rather to work on different kinds of AI regulations, the EU AI Act currently in development, for instance, and soon to be published some proposals around AI liability. The Commission is due to come out with that later this year, to address those questions about how do we actually deal with these issues that are raised when AI is changing over its lifetime, and where does liability lie in those kind of things, to address those without making that step of saying we need to insert an AI personhood kind of stage. And so really, AI personhood, as long as the AIs don't have linked with that some kind of an ability to take initiative on the enforcement of their own rights, or take initiative on choosing to follow or not to follow certain paths of actions that might be impacted by the fact that they have obligations under the law. As long as AIs aren't involved in any of these decisions, I don't really see what the purpose is of assigning a personhood to the AI. It makes more sense to clarify in the law how the accountabilities around what the AI is doing devolve to a party that actually has the ability to make those kinds of decisions, which is humans, either individual humans or humans as agglomerated within an organization.
Mhm. Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Back and in responding to your question about what do we gain, it's by granting AI's copyright or patent. My limited understanding of at least the United States situation is that those are granted partially in recognition of what we consider natural rights, but also partially in recognition to support commerce. You give a patent so that the person benefits from that. And it seems like granting an AI a patent might be a dead end, because then that person, that AI isn't going to necessarily be motivated to continue to do more with it. Unless and until, I guess, the AIs get that next level where they're actually out there searching and creating new stuff based on their what they've invented so far. So we've got a couple of questions showing up, and let's see. Let me go ahead and move on to these. Marvin Woods, thank you, Marvin, for bringing a question to us. People and things of physical form or foundations, what would be the form or body of an AI? So I think we've mentioned embodied AI at least once already. So anybody who feels like catching that one and giving your thoughts on what that means.
So I suppose this is maybe not a super exciting answer, but whilst the other gentlemen were speaking, I was thinking about other avenues and aspects of ethics or like political philosophy that we could borrow from. And I was thinking about rescue ethics, and the notion of like moral obligation to rescue starts generally about where you don't have to give up something of equitable moral value to perform the rescue, right? You don't need to self-sacrifice, but you should probably be willing to get your shoes dirty. Those are two very clear cases. Certainly the actual case is somewhere in the middle. So I was thinking of like, if we're on a literal boat and the things are drowning, what is it to say my AI is drowning? And I figure that unless it's in a robot, and even then maybe, that it is impossible to say that your AI is drowning, because the AI doesn't have a body. Unless you're really, really bad at like your data management and you happen to have the entirety of your model exist in a single instance in a single drive. And even then, I don't know that the drive is necessarily the body of the AI. That just seems to be one of many places the AI could have been, and it's your irresponsibility that limited the AI in this way. And we can think about movies for this. I know movies aren't like great academical resources, and I know that Marvel is far from the best of them when it comes to technological faith, but that whole idea of Jarvis continuing to survive even after multiple suits are blown up because he's just flittering through the network from place to place is an easy and convenient way to visualize the fact that an AI just wouldn't have a body. It wouldn't have a sort of continuity in that way, and that it doesn't necessarily need to. I don't know that we would necessarily deprive a human of consciousness or of personhood if somehow a human's consciousness was extracted from a body and put onto a network. I think we would still respect and be interested in whatever that consciousness represents. So I don't know that the fact that an AI can't have a body is necessarily prohibitive or problematic to the course of potential AI personhood. But I do think the answer is there is no such thing. Over.
Happy to have any further discussion of that if anybody would like to chime in.
I mean, there is certainly an aspect to embodied AI that does tend to lead us to think of it as closer to something that is an actual entity. And this is very much in the eye of the beholder. It is us that are projecting this onto it. I think one example of that is the attention that has been drawn to this so-called android Sophia, which I think is an absolutely terrible case, because it is leading people to project onto it all kinds of capacities that this machine does not have. It is effectively a puppet on strings. The strings are just electrical wires and electrical impulses as opposed to physical strings, but it is a puppet that is doing tasks it has no initiatives out in itself. However, because of the way in which it has been embodied in a puppet that looks like a sort of like a humanoid female, it has been given Saudi Arabian citizenship. Not personhood, but citizenship. I don't really know how you do that, separating the two, but it has. And it has attracted all kinds of attentions of that type that are ethically very concerning, because they really feed into this thing of making people believe that the machine can do more than it really can. And I think that also connects to a different element of what we discussed briefly in our pre-call to this, around the language that is used when it comes to AI. The fact that we're even calling it artificial intelligence when we don't even have a good definition of intelligence to begin with, and never mind figuring out whether this artificial entity has this kind of intelligence. But also machine learning, we're talking about learning, which makes us think that it is acquiring knowledge in the way that humans acquire knowledge, which is absolutely not the case. A lot of the language around AI is structured in a way to make us project onto it capabilities that it doesn't have. And it is some of that kind of projecting that is also leading to the sense that we need to be dealing with AI in a way that is different to the way in which we've been dealing with other kinds of tools with our existing data analytics frameworks. Machine learning is basically, it's complicated statistics. So why is this complicated statistics suddenly requiring a different way of dealing with it than the otherwise complicated statistics that we've been using?
Right.
Tony?
Thank you, Ansgar. I appreciate, oh, go ahead, Sandy.
Yes, so I like to jump in there, because we all worked with Nevin Taylor, who is simply brilliant. Another Presidential Innovation Fellow who moved on to the Consumer Product Safety Commission. He's done amazing work, but one of the things that Nevin likes to say is that artificial intelligence today is neither artificial or intelligent. So when I mentioned the systems that I put together that you used, and this is where it's important, that there were systems I put together to augment decisions by our teams at the General Services Administration. Those used sophisticated forms of statistics. So going to Ansgar's point is that right now, artificial intelligence is really statistics on steroids. We haven't gotten to where the qubit is the replacing our common way of compute power. And things could evolve. But one thing that I also wanted to add, besides the support of that and throwing out those points, is that the questions, and mostly what we're going to be concerned with in the federal government, is liability. So it was Jim St. Clair put it in there, one word, liability. So who is responsible and accountable? It's very hard to thread out the difference between responsibility and accountability, but it all falls into this mix. The last thing I'll say is that when you do come to the federal government, we work with, well, I'm no longer in the federal government. They work with regulations that come out of legislation. So those regulations, think of the federal acquisition regulations. And even those are broken down to more specific regulation. Those are broken into policies, into agency policies. That's where it's going to impact the government. So it's going to impact it on the on that side. The fun side that we're having is, and thanks, David, for what you brought out, is that there are two sides to this. There's that moral religious side, and there's the legal side, where the government is going to be focused on, and if we want to take this conversation forward and to help there, will be purely on the legal side. Over.
So, Tony, I think you had your hand up. If you've got I'd like to go ahead and invite you to contribute, to add something.
So I'm going to throw this out there, and then this might be like something that we need to table for a second, because we're moving past it possibly in a good way. But something that Ansgar was saying reminded me of something that came up a lot when we talk about animals and personhood and things like that. And it's the sort of idea of like, look, we're going to draw a line between what is a human natural intelligence and what is an artificial intelligence. Generally, we don't have to say one is better than the other. We can say they're different. But generally, when you have that stratification, you're going to find very quickly that there's humans that unfortunately are below or to the left of your line, and you're going to find animals or technology that tend to find themselves to the right or above your line. And I think that a lot of time the instance is to just do something that Ansgar did, which he's perfectly right and justified in doing, and just say, well, the machine just has strings and a series of electrical impulses make the strings twitch, and then that's just a very fancy marionette. But then I don't mean to be, that freshman in their first philosophy class or whatever, but I don't know that there's necessarily much interestingly different to our brains that isn't just a series of electrical and chemical strings that are pulling and making stuff happen. I mean, modern science tends to show that our brain starts to do things before we're aware of it, and that the notion of concrete decision is usually reinforcement, not activation, and all these other things that lead me to believe that we may be 100% correct that AI are just very fancy marionettes. But I don't know if we can then say, therefore, they're not people, because I do believe it's a good question to just go, well, humans are clearly people according to us, and they too are just extremely fancy marionettes. So I think as we think about I used to call it pull up, pull down, because clearly with animals, people always think they're lesser. So, when we're talking about all these reasons why we can't pull up artificial intelligence, let's make sure we're not accidentally saying things or not accidentally getting ourselves in a double bind where we have a double standard where we allow humans some special privilege merely because they're human. It's generally called speciesism, and it's not the best, at least when it comes to academic and political rigor.
Thank you, Tony. Dave?
I just wanted to circle back to where Marvin's question began about physical embodiment and boundaries. We asked the question, what's the physical embodiment of the AI? We can ask the same question of a corporation or an organization. What's the body of the organization? What's the body of the corporation? So I think in law, we already are engaging this problem in various ways because the modern corporation is as decentralized in many cases or as immaterial as what we think our AIs are. And so I think we have to at least keep that in mind, because the analogy maybe shouldn't be humans and animals, but rather the corporation as the kind of embodiment that we're thinking of.
So thank you, David. Let's go ahead. We've got a couple of questions that came up that I'd like to address. So actually, I'm gonna push it back to you real quick, Dave. In my ignorance, I'm not familiar with his first name, so I'm gonna go ahead and say Ibike, but I'm not sure that that's pronouncing it right. Apologies for that. But the question is, actually, it's an assertion and then a question. None of the panelists are supportive of legal personhood. Assuming such regulation exists, how do you think it would end? And David, I'm wondering if you want to take that one directly, because I think maybe you do have a view on that.
Yeah, I would say among the panelists here, I think I'm probably the one most in favor of legal personhood for AI, because I think it solves a number of problems with the social integration of these newer intelligent social artifacts into our world. How we do that, I think, is a complicated question. But I will say that for myself, the real challenge, I think, is can we come up with a new legal ontology that doesn't limit us to just person or thing? I mean, that comes from the Romans. Okay, it's worked for 2,000 years. Maybe in the 21st century, we have got to come up with a more fine-grained gradient theory of personhood that allows for distinctions that we didn't have previously, that doesn't just categorize something as a thing we can use and abuse as we see fit, or another legal subject that is a full recognized legal person. I think that's far too limiting for the kinds of challenges that we're looking at.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm a big fan of ontologies in general. I think they're really helpful. But I wonder how we would address it seems like a risk of creating a gradient of personhood. And maybe it's related to Tony's point of pull up, pull down. Then you've created this category, and then there might be a risk of misclassification. And I guess that's what you're referring to, Dave, is that there's a risk of doing it, but that it might be necessary.
So if I can make it the scenario even more terrifying in some ways, usually when you have a dichotomy, whether false or real, thing or person, you say, okay, well, so let's figure out the middle. What's the middle ground? What's in between? And historically, both in legal philosophy and in moral philosophy, we have had a middle ground of entities that are sometimes persons and sometimes things based on context. And unfortunately, they're called slaves. So the Roman slave law recognized slaves as property, but they could also engage in business transactions on behalf of their master. So therefore, they were persons for the contracting procedures, but they were property in terms of their legal status with regards to who owned them. And you're seeing in a lot of the legal literature proposals for what you can only call slavery 2.0, which is this kind of in-between position for the AI. And I think that's really a disturbing kind of trend because, not only is that a historically very cumbersome, burdensome kind of tradition to even think about, but I think the problems that this brings up are much greater than the solutions that we think we're getting out of it.
Right. Thank you for that. And I do think that's there's some real challenges there, but that's why we have to have the conversation. There's a really good conversation happening in the chat right now, just for folks who want to take a look at it around the semantics and the terminology. And that's a reason, one of the main reasons we wanted to pull this together is to begin that conversation. I do want to address another question. We've got a couple of questions that in the Q&A that Julia has asked about representation. And I just wanted to address that. I'm not sure how much conversation we can have about it because it would turn into a completely different, although very valid conversation. She asks, she notes that she would very much like to see the voice of women of color represented in this conversation. And then she goes on to note that all speakers of ATARC seem to be white men. I would very, very much like to engage with women of color, people of all types, people of all perspectives on these questions, because I think they're vital. If we don't, we're going to make important mistakes. We're going to continue to make mistakes. In fact, I think AI right now has a very significant PR problem. And I think part of the reason for that is because of the lack of engagement of different perspectives and views. If there's any way that you can help us, and I have to ask for help for this, to get in touch with folks that you think should be involved, I would very much like to have that conversation. This panel was created by happenstance, and it is an issue of access, which leads us to the conversation we're having now. And I would like to work against that issue, and if you can help me, I'd appreciate it. So one thing I had a question for the panel on, and it's related to the issue or the question around language and this issue around PR, and it's related also to the Google engineer, and because I would like to just get that addressed and get your perspectives on it, is that we've got a very, I think, a very strong emerging conversation society-wide around AI, and it's not favorable. At least I don't see it as being favorable right now, although all of us in this discussion are interested and somewhat invested in different ways in AI. Would you each share just your view on how we might better address this issue we have with the public perspective or perception of AI, and whether you are individually engaged in any way that can help make that a productive conversation? And just to make it easier, I'll go ahead and go with the order we used before, just logistically. I'm putting you on the spot, Tony. Sorry about that, but would you mind going first?
Sure. Sorry, I was so distracted by the conversation in the chat. What was the question again? One more time? Sorry.
The question is whether you see a societal discussion on AI being negative for AI, and how do you think we might make that a more productive conversation?
Sure. Okay, great. So I think that it's technically positive for AI if AI was arrogant, but I suppose that sort of dates the whole question we're having here, because people seem to think that generally the popular discourse, anywhere from classrooms to bus stops to Congress, seems to indicate that there's this common notion that AI is far more capable and far more concerning than it could possibly be. But also because of that picture of generalized AI intelligence and the thought that AI is sort of like a robotic human, I think that also there's a great swath of opportunity for AI to do work for us that we miss. Individuals with it is, I think it's the same lack of familiarity that will breed fear as there will breed underutilization. I don't know. I have a theory of how to get around that. I assume it has to do something with education. I know that my office is attempting to work towards that in a long-term way. We're trying to build an AI-powered system that will teach AI, among other things, that we're trying to build as public property so it can be given to the public. And I suppose with better education, with better familiarity, a situation could fix itself. But we also said the same thing about like cynical voters for the past 30 years, and that's gone nowhere. So I suppose my hope is that we could address what seems to be a mix of over-optimism and underutilization of AI through awareness.
Thank you. Ansgar?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of strands that lead to the perception around AI being problematic. One of them is exactly what Tony was talking about, that we're too imprecise when we're talking about what we actually mean when we say AI. And I mean, this is, for instance, one of the focus areas of criticism on the EU's AI Act, that the definition of AI that they give is so broad that it captures everything. But in a way, that is the definition that most people have in their mind when they're talking about AI, is we're not being clear as to, is the natural language processing module within my smartphone, is that the AI, or am I capturing the whole smartphone as being AI? What about the Excel sheet where I've done a bit of great hacking for a macro? Where do I start calling something an AI? Does it have to be machine learning in order for it to be AI or not? All of those things, we're very sloppy when we're talking about AI, and we have fights between the technical community and the policy community about how to scope what is considered to be in AI. But the general public, and to a large extent, I think that is more aligned with how the policy community approaches it, is thinking AI is anything where we are doing an automation that touches on some kind of decision making. As such, there is the sense of moving responsibility onto a machine, which means taking distancing ourselves, the organization, from that responsibility. And that's something that we always need to be suspect of. So that's one reason to be suspicious of AI, because responsibility is being pushed onto this other thing, which doesn't have personhood. It doesn't have actual capabilities of that a human does. And therefore, if we push the responsibility on the AI, basically nobody takes responsibility.
Thank you.
There's also just the fact that big tech is the driver behind AI, and big tech is going through a loss of trust. And that is, amongst other things, linked to things like the ongoing challenges around data privacy, and that people feel like their data is being used for purposes other than what they understood. AI is implicated in that, so becomes another part of the ecosystem that you can't trust, and therefore is problematic.
Thank you, Ansgar. Sandy, I don't know, I'd love to have your input on this. The question was whether you see the societal conversation on AI being negative towards AI, and how you think we might be able to engage that to make it more productive.
Well, I'm not really concerned about that larger societal.
Okay.
I'm more targeted to what are the ethics, and that's what's important here, because society is going to evolve, and there's going to be lots of discussions and many movies and lots of books that people will read, but it gets down to the ethics of anything that we automate. So when we start to augment ourselves, and remember, we're augmenting ourselves, no, we're not replacing ourselves. Tony works in the NI, and we work with, well, when I was there, we work with folks who are in the radiological community looking at, and Amora is on this, you know, and as somebody pointed out earlier is here. We look at that data. We don't look at that data to make the determination for the patient. We look at that data to augment what that radiologist can do so that they can see more and perhaps be more accurate. So when we start to break down the ethical application of anything, there are parts of that. And the concern going forward with AI is just what was brought up by someone here, that you have this panel that doesn't exclude purposefully certain people, but it is excluding certain groups. And what biases enter there? And we have to be concerned about the bias simply in what research is done and where the data starts to come from. And there's perhaps imperfections in that will never get to totally good. Hopefully what we'll do is that as the pendulum swings, we'll narrow the field so that we get closer and closer to what would be considered fairness. So in the paper that we did, there were 5 aspects to what would be ethical application of AI. And I really encourage people to look at that rather than, is somebody going to like my AI? Well, like a different flavor of ice cream, but I don't care about that. I care about the ethics, and bias is one key part of ethics, but it's only one of 5 parts that make it ethical or not. Over.
Thanks, Sandy. Nicole, can we give David a few minutes to answer that question?
Sure.
Thanks, I appreciate it. I know we're just about out of time. Thank you.
So I'll just, to everything that was just said, I'll just add 2 small components. AI and AI ethics have a communications problem, right? We see hype being circulated in the popular media in particular, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that journalists are not well trained in the technology to be able to talk about it and write about it in a way that communicates effectively the innovations that are being developed on the technology side. So I think we have a real need to bring people up to speed on this technology and not keep it in the hands of various elite institutions and various sort of siloed organizations and disciplines like AI or computer science. And I think we're only now beginning to realize that we need to teach AI across the curriculum and get people well versed in this technology to be able to have these conversations, because in democratic governance, you want to hear from everyone, not just the experts, right? And you want to be able to have everyone a party to the conversation. And I think that's something we as educators have to do, but also culturally, we have to take this very seriously as educating a public in the process of communicating findings and new innovations. I'll also say that the field of AI ethics in particular has a diversity problem. It has recognized this and it's been trying to grapple with it, but we should also recognize that when we say ethics, we are oftentimes only talking about Eurocentric thinking about ethics. We're talking about Kant. We're talking about utilitarianism. We're talking about, the ways that we think about ethics from a European perspective and through a European lens. That's not the only way to do this work. And I think we need to bring in a wider range of perspectives on asking these questions and deliberating on these questions from non-Western perspectives that come either out of indigenous traditions, that come from either Confucianism or Buddhism. But there's a real push now in AI ethics to try to diversify the conversation. And I think that's a really important innovation that's happening on the side of this conversation, because when you get everyone involved in this debate, you get new ways of looking at these problems and new ways of coming up with solutions that are a little more attentive to what is necessary with regards to how this stuff interfaces with human communities.
Thank you, David. I appreciate that. And cognizant of the time and respectful of everybody's schedule, I just wanted to close this out by thanking the panelists again. I hope this has been useful for attendees. We'll probably be putting together a summary of this and we'll make it available online just so that everybody can take a look at it. And hopefully this has been a useful beginning of the conversation for our government friends and the broader audience. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
All right, and thank you all of you for the panelists for joining and giving your insight. It's really very helpful. And to the ATARC's AI and Data Policy Working Group, thank you all for putting it together as well. And I will see you guys all hopefully at the next ATARC event. Bye, everyone.